welcome back. I'm Tedward, and today we're going to talk about how I grew up as a pilot. I started flying at the age of 11 at this very airport. Actually, this is Hopedale Airport 1 Bravo 6, the first place I ever took off in an airplane on my own. And that used to be the FBO, the fixed base operation, where the flight school was. There is no flight school here anymore, and there hasn't been for quite some time. We'll talk about that. But let me just start the M3. And we'll have a little bit of story time. It's very cold out today, so forgive me if I don't go and do a walk around. I want to be warm. I've got my heated seat on. You know, this is where we want to be. But, you know, a lot of people think like, oh, if you were a pilot as a kid, it meant one of two things. You had like super wealthy parents, or your family had an airplane, which I guess maybe that's the same thing. I don't know very many poor people with airplanes. Neither of those are true. The truth is, I was just a really weird kid. And I know you're thinking like, Tedward, but you're so well adjusted. How you were a weird kid? Yes, I was a very weird kid. I was an overweight kid. I had really bad asthma, so sports were not really an option for me. I was not, I think in kindergarten I played soccer. That was the height of my sporting career. And then I never went back to it. My sister was the all-star athlete and the valedictorian of her high school class, so she kind of got all those good genes. I just got good spatial awareness and I guess a gyroscope that allows me to go sideways in a car once in a while. So growing up, I loved everything mechanical. I was always a big car freak. So there's like, when people say like, what got you into cars? I mean, birth. But the same goes for airplanes, because I lived near an airport. I got to see these planes take off and land all the time. And I was fascinated by it. Anything mechanical, anything that moved, anything that had an engine, that's what I wanted to be part of. So Microsoft Flight Simulator, I want to say 98 was out at the time. And my dad got me the flight sim. So I had a joystick, I could play on the computer, and I was learning all about how to fly an airplane. I mean, that's really what Flight Simulator did. It taught you how to fly an airplane. And anyone who's played any of the more modern ones, especially the new one, you've got the world at your fingertips, literally. It's incredible. And you can really figure out what it's like to dynamically fly an airplane. You understand how airspeed affects the dynamics, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so at age 11, my dad came into the room where we had our flight sim and said, hey, do you want to fly a real airplane? I'm like, well, yeah. And he goes, great. I signed you up for an introductory lesson. And at the time, I don't know how it is now, but like an intro lesson was like $40, $50. This was not a huge expense. I mean, it really was like just trying to lure you in to the sport. This stop sign is somewhat new. I hope it's new, because I definitely didn't used to stop here before. Okay, so I go up for my first flight lesson. It's in a Cessna 172. My dad sat in the back. I've got my flight instructor, Freddie. I'll never forget Freddie. Freddie was a maniac, and I'll talk about him later too. We get off the ground. We go, and I'm flying an airplane. I mean, granted, I couldn't reach the pedals, but then I was hooked. That was the deal. But flying is expensive, and it's difficult to put a child through flight school, because at age 11 or 12, where I was, you can't get a license until you're 17. That is the wrong side of the road, buddy. And you can't solo till you're 16. So what are you really aiming to do here? I mean, it's hard to set up your whole thing. But, the deal was I could fly once a month. I'd get my hour. And anyone who's like in flight school today as an adult would laugh at that. You'd be like, there's no way you can learn to fly an hour a month. Like, you've got to be flying a lot. It is a repetitive thing. You need to be current. You need to really like become part of the airplane. And that was hard to do as a kid. But at the end of the day, like, that's just what I love to do. And I didn't have very many friends my age. I mean, I got along with some kids, but like I said, I was a weird kid. I wasn't participating in like the sports teams that all the normal kids, that's not nice to say, but they were. I wasn't a normal kid. So, and they didn't like me. They made fun of me for it anyway. So it wasn't like I was cool. It wasn't like I flew airplanes and it made me cool. If anything, it made me worse, because I was different. And they were like, oh, this loser flies airplanes and he can't kick a soccer ball. So instead of befriending kids my own age, I started making friends with adults at the flight school. These were people that were, well older than me, 25, 35, some as old as like 60, that were like my pilot buddies. These are people that I spent time with. And we actually had a flight club. Definitely a pun on Fight Club, but we all thought we were very cool back then. At least maybe I was just hanging out with a group of nerdy adults, but I thought they were cool because I was like 13. So I actually met these people because there was a landing contest at that very airport that we were at earlier. This landing contest, they laid out 2 strips of ribbon on the ground. And the idea was you would come in and you try to put it in the box, like land in the box and get as close as you could to the first ribbon. And I went up and I did 3 landings, and at age 13, I nailed the line. I was only a couple feet off that line. And until they decided they wanted to make more money and say, yeah, everybody go and take as many shots at this as you want, I was winning. I basically was winning this landing contest at age 13. And so everyone knew who I was in the flight school at that point. They're like, who is this kid? And later on, I'm at an air show at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. This is a big air show. This is where they bring out the Blue Angels. I've seen an SR-71 Blackbird do flyovers at this air show. It's a pretty cool air show. And my dad would take me to this air show, and we're standing up against the fence watching all the things, and I heard somebody mention a name that I recognized next to me. And there was this group of people. And I was like, wait, are you talking about Freddie? Freddie from Hopedale? My instructor? And they go, yeah. And I'm like, oh, I fly out of Hopedale. And they all looked at me with disdain because they realized, oh, that's that little kid who beat us in the landing contest. Except for one guy, the youngest of the group. His name was Chris. He was probably in his early or mid-20s at the time. And he was like, oh my goodness, we have a flight club. Why don't you come hang out with us? And they all looked at him like, oh my God, Chris, did you just invite a 13-year-old child to be part of our flight club? Where at the time what they were doing is maybe 5 people, and they all worked at a corporate company down the street. They got discounts at the airport because of that company, right? So they all got together every Thursday and they would study together because they were all going for their private pilot license, or some of them were going for their IFR and stuff, but they would all just use that time to be together and study and talk about aviation. So they invited me to start going to these things, and it was actually held at the corporation. So I'd go to the corporation after hours, 5, 6 p.m. on a Thursday, and I'd sign in and I'd go up to the conference room and we'd order pizza and talk about flying. But that evolved because then they kind of welcomed me. I was Squirt. They called me Squirt, and when I turned 14, they called me Squid because they said I was too young to be a Squirt. So I became Squid. So as a young Squid, there I was, going flying every weekend with these people because they were like, hey, I'm going on a flight, why don't you come with me? So while I was only really flying once a month or once or every 2 weeks for my own training, I was flying every single weekend pretty much if the weather was good with my friends who would literally just call me. One of them lived down the street, my friend Russ, and he would come pick me up and we would go flying. We'd fly all over the place. We'd go to Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, up through New Hampshire, out to Western Mass, just anything. And this became a very regular thing. And that's kind of who my friends were in high school. I had friends in high school for sure, but while everyone else was out partying and drinking, I was flying airplanes. And trust me, it wasn't cool. No one thought I was cool. Absolutely no one thought I was cool. And my whole family was pretty much involved in this because we would go on these trips. I remember there was a trip where Freddie, he had to fly somebody down to Virginia in a Baron 58. And if you don't know what a Baron 58 is, it's kind of like a hot rod, 6-seater, twin-engine Beechcraft. It's got short wings, it's got 2 engines with 3-blade props on it. It's pretty powerful. And he actually flew this plane from Australia because the flight school bought this plane from Toowoomba or something. I don't even know what it was. But he flew this plane from Australia to Massachusetts. So he had a great relationship with this aircraft, and he invited me to go fly some guy down to Virginia. So I went with him, and when we got home, the flight school was like, hey, we're all gonna go out to dinner in White Plains, and then we're gonna go fly the Corridor. Now this is all pre-2001, pre-9/11. And if you don't know what the Corridor is, you can do it now, but it was different then. You basically fly under the airspace, under Bravo airspace, under LaGuardia, under JFK, under Newark, really low over the Hudson River at 300 or less feet. So you're basically staring out at the city. You look out the window and that's New York City, that's Manhattan. And I remember my whole family in this airplane, my mother's still terrified by this. The first time I ever saw New York, the first time I ever saw the Statue of Liberty was basically flying over the Hudson River at night, really, really low, and we circled the Statue of Liberty, super duper low. It was amazing. And that, that became normal to me that this is what we do. These are my weekends. So fast forward, 16 was a really important age for me because number one, I really wanted to drive. And when you're 16 in Massachusetts, that's when you can go and get your learner's permit. So you can drive with someone, of age in the car. And it also is the age in which you can fly an airplane solo if you get signed off by your instructor and you have a medical certificate. So on my 16th birthday, my dad, I woke him up so early and I made him drive me straight to the RMV early, like 45 minutes before it opened, so I could be first in line to go in and take my written test and make sure that I was going to get my learner's permit, and then I was going to drive myself with him in the car to, well, he didn't know that yet, to the medical examiner, for like 40 miles away. So I get my learner's permit, and then I'm like, great, I'm driving. He goes, absolutely not, you're not driving. And it was the Volkswagen, it was a manual transmission. I said, please, Dad, please. This is literally all I have ever wanted is to be able to drive a car to the medical examiner's office so I can go and solo an airplane. He lets me drive on the highway. My first drive in a car was my Volkswagen Golf. It was 1994, 2-liter Golf, 4-cylinder, and I drove it on 495 on like a real highway, and we went to the medical examiner's office. They checked me out. They did all the vision checks and the blood pressure and all the things and made sure that I was fit to fly. And I got my, I guess it's a third class medical certificate? I think that's what it's called. And I went straight to the airport. And so we go to the airport and I'm supposed to fly, and it all fell apart. It was way too windy. This was not a good day to solo, and I knew it. I mean, I was looking at that windsock and I was like, today's not the day. And my instructor just kind of nodded at me, and he was proud that I knew. And that's important. That's honestly, the most important thing you can do as a pilot is know when you shouldn't be flying. That's how everybody dies most of the time. Like, should you be flying today? And if the answer is yes, but the real answer is no, then you die. That's how JFK Jr. died. That's how a lot of aircraft incidents occur. So we made the no-go decision, and I think it was like 2 days later that I went and I soloed. And when you fly by yourself, my goodness, is it a different experience. It really is. There's nothing like flying by yourself, because I'm flying a little Cessna 152. They're very light aircraft, and it feels completely different. I mean, you want to talk about power to weight ratio. Man, it's like you've just gotten the 300-pound instructor out of your Caterham with 140 horsepower. Like, it's a different animal, and I was so liberated. I remember the takeoff roll being short. I remember the climb rate being more aggressive. I remember going through the pattern and executing 3 landings and just being so excited that I was doing it. But I was also a little terrified, because for the first time, someone wasn't sitting next to me who could fix my mistakes, who could actually bail us out of a big incident, right? So I landed 3 times, and then in tradition, this is kind of a big thing in the aviation community. I thought it was just us, but apparently I've seen it everywhere. A lot of times someone will come and they dump a huge thing of Gatorade over you, or water, ice water, and then rip your shirt off. Like, that's the thing. And then they all sign your shirt and you keep your shirt. I still have my shirt. I still have the shirt they ripped off of me when I pulled back into the pumps. And that's like really one of the biggest moments in a pilot's career, is when you have flown and successfully taken off and landed a plane by yourself. Now, like I told you, I did have some fear. And earlier in my training, when I was like 14, 15 years old, I had no fear. I was completely fearless. I had great instructors too, because I had certain instructors who were like bush pilots, who were people that were like a little nutty, people that did things in airplanes that I never dreamed of. They were crop dusters, and not the farting kind, like an actual crop duster. They were banner tow pilots. They were aerobatic pilots, and these guys were great. I learned a lot from these guys, because what they would do is they would take me out to these airports where you would have like incredibly short runways, and there's a runway called Cranland in Massachusetts, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's in all these cranberry bogs. So Cranland, and I remember just loving to put airplanes down in very dicey environments and say like, oh, I bet you can't make the first taxiway, and you'd put the plane down and lock up the brakes, and you'd collect your $5 from your instructor, who was just out of his mind, which was fun. But then as I got older, and I don't know if this is all people, some people I don't think ever really get the fear, but I just call it the fear. I remember getting the fear. I remember there was a time when I was flying as a passenger in the back seat of a Cessna 172, and it wasn't vertigo, it was just this overwhelming sense of like, whoa, what if we crashed? Like, what if we crashed? And it really tormented me. And I think what was happening was I was becoming an adult. It's just that instead of becoming an adult like a normal kid who maybe like fell off their bike or something, like I was becoming an adult at like 3,500 feet, wondering like, whoa, mortality is really dark and real, and I could die in this aircraft. So after soloing, I went and I did my little cross-country trips. And a cross-country doesn't literally mean like you're flying across the country. If you're not a pilot, a cross-country trip I think is anything greater than like 50 nautical miles. And then you would do a long cross-country where you can basically prove that you can navigate to a series of waypoints. So you take off from your home airport and you'd fly 50 miles to the first airport, then a second airport, a third airport, and home, something along those lines. So you've got to be aware. And then when you're doing all your own communications, that was always something that tripped me up. Because like one of the things I like about driving is that although there are rules and there is etiquette, it is a little more freeform. Like if I want to get the tail out a little bit, if I want to attack an on-ramp, although it may be bending the rules, I can still do it in a pretty safe manner. With airplanes, I always felt like I was very bound to the rules. And I didn't want to break those rules. I wanted to be an upstanding pilot. I wanted to be a good citizen of the sky. But I just felt like a lot of pressure that like, oh, what if I mess up? Or what if I like don't talk to the tower correctly? What if I do something wrong? And I really hated that feeling. And I started getting into my own head. And like, that's when I learned like, oh, Tom, you have crippling anxiety. And maybe flying airplanes is like a little not great for that. So I stopped flying, not because I wanted to stop flying, but because I went to college. And I was also more interested in cars, and I really wanted to own a car. And, you know, I inherited my dad's Volkswagen, thankfully, but I still had to fix it. I had to put gas in it. And money was not on the table for flying when college came into the picture, because I was going to an engineering school that was costing like $40,000 a year. So it wasn't like, oh, here's your budget for flying. So, you know, it just kind of petered out and it faded. And, you know, it's like a really weird thing for me, because I just became a normal person. I became like, I was no longer a weird kid. I was like a normal college student. I was doing college student things, and aviation just wasn't part of that. But it's just not really a priority in my life. But I do watch a lot of aviation YouTube, and I love it. So that's the story. I mean, I grew up flying airplanes, and you know, there's a lot of people who can remember me showing up to the airport with my pillows because I couldn't reach the pedals. I had to put a couple actual like pillows from my parents' couch on the seat. And I remember when I grew tall enough, when I could finally taxi an airplane by myself because I could reach the rudder pedals and the brakes. You know, that just wasn't something that I could do when I started. And it was a really weird thing because I grew into the planes. But in the end, cars took over, man. I got that license. I started driving. I tried to drive all my friends' cars. I wanted to know what everything was like. And here we are today. I'm basically just doing that as an adult now. So thank you guys so much for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Let me know if you like the story time videos. I've got a million of these things. I can go in depth on a bunch of stuff, but I wanted to give you an overview because I think, you know, I always get messages on Instagram like, wait a minute, you were a pilot or you know anything about airplanes, you're interested in aviation. There's a whole aviation community out there that's probably, you know, just as large and way more knowledgeable than some of the people in the automotive community. It's pretty outrageous. So don't forget to respect the drive or respect the sky, depending on what kind of vehicle you are in control of today. I'll see you in the next one. The airport that I started flying at, actually, the flight school went out of business because they had a series of plane crashes, and I think it just crippled them. I don't think they had the funding to keep it going because they had a Seneca that they were doing multi-engine training on, and that a nose gear collapsed. It skidded down the runway, destroyed the plane. And then a 172 flipped over with my instructor in it, actually. I remember flying with my instructor very recently, like shortly after he crashed that plane or was part of that plane crash. And I remember he changed a lot. I actually stopped flying with that guy because he was so skittish, and his fear of what had just happened to him, I think, translated into his teaching. And I don't know that he was really able to do that anymore.